It's dedicated to the theme of mobilization, social change, and revolution. And we have three eminent scholars here to speak to us. The first, Dr. David Lane, colleague here in the department, who's an expert on the transition to capitalism, post-communist world. He's going to speak to us about a subject that we actually teach at the MPhil level together on the question of alternatives to capitalism. So he's going to talk to us for about 20 minutes here, 15 to 20 minutes on alternative scenarios to national capitalism or market socialism. And then after that, we'll introduce, before each speaks, we'll see Professor Ken Wells and Dr. Manali Desai as well, each speaking for 15 to 20 minutes. And I'll introduce them before they speak. So, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much. And as we heard this morning, the global economic crisis led to serious destabilization, particularly in the neoliberal economies of Western countries. What I want to talk about is what were the reactions. On the 29th of April 2009, President Obama declared, "We cannot rebuild this economy on the same pile of sand." And there was an expectation that great changes would take place. And those of you who know American politics will always know that when an American politician says something, the audience always has a retort. And the retort was, "Yes, we can." Well, under the sand were very firm foundations, both economically, politically, and intellectually. Obama was confronted by the dominant ideology of neoliberalism, private property, market fundamentalism, competition, and freedom, and an economy driven by unregulated financial systems. The barriers to change were really considerable, as he was confronted by an elite consensus which penetrated media, politics, all the main political parties, and the economic intelligentsia, as well as the general social science intelligentsia. This elite consensus reflected the power of the dominant ruling class. What were the responses then? Firstly, there was a response among elite thinking. This response was, well, it's a lack of economic understanding of neoliberalism, which can be rectified. So the neoliberal version was faulted in the fact that the state had too much spending power. There was not enough neoliberalism, and more competition was needed, for instance, between banks. Secondly, there were elite-led proposals of reform, and these involved the modification of the financialization and the stronger state for state management and international regulation. The heterodox economists, they argued, as I think was indicated by Larry King this morning, well, more Keynesianism, better management of capitalism. And if you look at the Cambridge Journal of Economics in 2007, for instance, number 33, you'll see that the discussion of the economic crisis was very much more in post-Keynesian terms. There was no vision of an alternative ways to implement a policy on a state basis. And the upshot of this, as again we heard this morning, was the austerity state, taxpayers effectively paying for the financial sector losses. There was no effective challenge to neoliberalism ideology. It is important, I think, to understand why there was such lack of protest in an ideological sense. This is because, as I mentioned earlier, the barriers were extremely strong. Neoliberalism, liberal hegemony and globalized network economies confronted people who were concerned with the international system. There was an interpenetration of financial companies with politics, with the media, and with academia, particularly in terms of the ideology in economics. And the elite consensus was based on the tenets of neoliberalism. Politically, globalization of capital detached power from the nation states, and states then became locked in to global networks and interests, but also no global democratic organizations. This consequently nullified the electoral system as a vehicle of change, and again we heard some statement of this morning. This led to bottom-up responses, the rise of fringe protest groups, anti-capitalism, anti-Wall Street, Occupy Now movements, and also to an autonomous Marxist response. That was people like John Holloway, for instance, widen the cracks of capitalism and then sort of take over the capitalist system. These, however, none of these views, I think, really transcend immediate local issues. And Holloway puts this very well when he says, the means is the end. There's a lack of political agency in these particular movements. Spontaneity, act now, replaces political parties or movements. And there's both an anti-electoral democracy movement and also an anti-Leninist movement. So in other words, the traditional means of political change are renounced by these extra electoral protests. There is then an inadequate, these are inadequate theoretically as an alternative to neoliberal capitalism. It lacks social and sociological and economic analysis. And I think the upshot of this is a lack of sociological imagination. There's no counter-ideology from the elites, from the counter-elites, from Marxist or libertarian critics. At best, what one has are islands of sand, islands of resistance cut off from the mainstream of politics. The challenge then of an alternative is to construct an economic and political paradigm. And I think that this presupposes any further major political alternatives. The need for a political, theoretical paradigm is important. Before any alternative policies have any chance of becoming politically acceptable, an alternative paradigm has to be articulated. And we heard a little bit about this this morning, in the absence of these ideas. People have to be able to think in a different way, in different terms. They have to legitimate policies by reference to ideology, no use simply asserting particular values. Critical ideas have to exist in the public consciousness, and they have to be recognized as alternatives. But what I'm going to do is just to talk about two alternatives. It's impossible in the time which I've got really to give the details, because people will say, well, what's your alternative? And you've always got thousands of objections, but I can only give you some of the main details, and that probably will seem to be too much for you. So I'm going to talk about national organized capitalism and market socialism. And these approaches hold in common a shift away from the hegemony of the world financially driven market and global companies to a state-led form of national economy. So it's both a left and a right-wing approach, as somebody pointed out this morning. The alternative is legitimated in prioritization of national human and economic development. The political actors are parties and social movements. Both allow for cumulative marginal changes, and both allow for socialization of capitalism. What then is nationally organized capitalism? This is an alternative capitalism, rather than an alternative to capitalism. State and nation are brought into unity under capitalism. State coordination takes place of private interest. The state coordinates private interests. This particular movement doesn't challenge doesn't threaten the private ownership of assets, particularly. It doesn't theorize a movement towards public ownership. drivers are political parties with a populist base and with business finance. So the essential feature is market relations with private, mixed ownership companies producing for profit concurrent with a regulative nation state. Profits continue and even increase. Domestic capitalist class stays in place, it's even strengthened. It's hostile, however, to international financial capitalist interests, but not to the real capitalist economy. And those of you who know a little bit about the history of economic thought will see here the influence of people like Friedrich List and Werner Sombart. The political means are to carry out these activities are through indicative planning, that is incentives for the private sector determined by state priorities, and a state-led form of capitalist coordination ensuring accumulation. Protection through tariffs, discrimination in favour of home industries, and the securing profits for private business. So, national capitalism is a corporate system in a national shell. It recognises the interests of stakeholders. Companies are required to exercise greater social responsibility to employees, consumers, suppliers, localities, and shareholders. In other words, it's a corporate system. So a lot of the stuff you have on corporate responsibility can be fitted into this model. National sentiments replace neoliberal motivations. So, to follow the saying of Mao Zedong, the market bird flies in a national capitalist cage. The second scenario is that of market socialism, and this is a hybrid system of capitalist, we started 5 minutes late.
Yeah.
The mixture of capitalists as market and private ownership, and socialists as planning and state ownership. It entails a priority of state control through public ownership and public control. So this is an alternative to capitalism. The drivers are political parties and unions. It's based on a socialist ideology, prioritising equality, full employment and social security of citizens. The ownership relations include an extension of state ownership of large companies and financial and non-financial companies. Support are employees, unions, and an alliance, at least initially, with small and medium capitalists. Economic coordination is carried out through state planning rather than the market. Public ownership then it enables a minimum levels of control on social security and social responsibility. One of the problems here is the tension between planning and market, between private and public ownership. The market creates inequalities, for instance, as we know from the history of China. But the optimistic view here is these contradictions would be resolved through time. The levels of support then for national capitalism, and we heard something about these in the papers this morning, national capitalism would have the support of national economic and political elites. Private corporations would gain, they would socialise losses, and they would privatise profits, something which we already see under neoliberalism. State employees, the middle classes and small business would benefit from state transfers. If it was a more effective variety of capitalism, they could expect electoral support. The ideology of nation would give this considerable affinity with the electorate. The opposition would come from globalized corporations and institutions. As far as market socialism is concerned, the support there would come from below. It's at present a minor presence in the existing elite structure, including that of, say, the left, the Labour Party, rally here about market socialism these days. Electoral support would be the potential class alliance between the working class and middle class and small and medium business. Particularly, there would be support within the state sector. So socialism has to be seen in a national context. A national ideology can provide the basis for this, and as we heard this morning, Scots nationalists would be one model of this, whereas UKIP would be a model for the national capitalism. The opposition again would come from globalized corporations and institutions. I'm coming to an end now. And what then would be politically expedient in the West? I think that national capitalism probably, in the given situation, seems to be the most likely, because it involves within-system change, it's elite-led. Ideologically, the state would have a national capitalist basis. It preserves capitalism in a national shell, so it doesn't require any major systemic changes. Politically, it can be elite-led, and is already in place in terms of anti-European Union political tendencies and also anti-globalization tendencies. UKIP is a very good example, and is the European right revival, for instance, in France, National Front in Hungary, places like this. Economic, it will secure private corporations and lower risk. Lowers the risk as the government will take the risk. The state takes the risk. Socially, to secure social stability, as it would have wide social appeal. And the ideological vacuum, which people again have talked about today, the general malaise of the population, the way in which electoral democracy no longer has any appeal, this would in fact be an advantage, because it can, these powers, elite-led powers, can utilize electoral democracy to come to power. What about market socialism? Well, this is a form of transformation from below, which is always much more difficult. And here, I think, one has a longer-term scenario. It lacks, currently, an ideological development. Socialist ideas are dormant, not dead, but I don't think they should, for that reason, be discounted. Remember the history of neoliberalism, for instance. Before Margaret Thatcher, ideas of neoliberalism would be considered as purely utopian. No one in the 1970s would give 2 minutes for neoliberalism. And again, perhaps they wouldn't, if you talked in the terms of Scottish nationalism in the 1970s, you wouldn't find very much of an audience. 20 years later, Margaret Thatcher had captured the Labour Party under Tony Blair. So there's a way in which what appears to be an impossible ideological standpoint can change if circumstances change and if the leadership is right. So a revival is possible, as the Scots nationalists have shown. There's widespread, even widespread now, support for nationalisation of utilities and the financial system. These changes are marginal and cumulative. And the vehicle which could be utilised is that of electoral democracy. Though it doesn't require any kind of revolutionary activity. So there is a legitimacy already built into this approach. State socialism is a hybrid system. It could lead to socialism if the conditions are right and the leadership is in place. But let me just finish with one in my last minute to conclude that this has to be seen, all these developments have to be seen in the context of globalization. Either option will be conditioned by and in turn will impact on the structure and process of the world system. So one has to look at not just the developments in one country, but how it affects other countries and how other countries affect these kinds of developments. So a spatial dimension here is important, and one would need to look at the weakness in the link of the capitalist chain. So here one can perhaps update some Leninist ideas and try to determine where currently the weakest links in the capitalist chains are. And I would suggest that the semi-core countries like Russia and China, which are not locked into the global system, and the wider grouping of BRICS, developments in Latin America, for instance, probably are weaker elements in the chain than they are in the advanced industrial countries. It would be very difficult to make these kind of changes in the United States or in the European Union, for example. So the economically advanced but hybrid state coordination, the legacy of state socialism, the weak capitalist class, and the large communist parties in countries like Russia and China all would lead me to suggest that probably movements of this kind could develop here. But this would depend on international factors, on the way in which the international economy meets a crisis, whether it develops and how the crises are managed. But whatever the character of the new social formation, national capitalism or socialism, it would form a counterpoint to current hegemonic neoliberal capitalism.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Professor Jane Wills, who's a professor of human geography in the Department of Geography at Queen Mary University of London. Her research works on the changing political economy of work, employment, labor supply, and labor politics, new forms of urban political alliances, with a particular interest in community organizing, and most recently the politics and practice of localism in the United Kingdom. She's here today to speak to us about work, politics, and the living wage. So we got 15 to 20 minutes as well.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for inviting me. I thought I'd start talking about the changes in work, because there's been absolutely immense changes in the last 30 years. And all the talks this morning were kind of taking that for granted, because the things they were talking about were a high level of abstraction. But on the ground, what's been going on is the an immense downward pressure on jobs, routinized jobs at the bottom end, or even the bottom half of the labour market. At the same time, there has been polarisation, so much greater gains for qualifications and so on, but professional elite, because polarisation has happened at the same time. But huge pressure downward in terms of wages and conditions. So most obviously this is associated with subcontracting, which is now paradigmatic in all these jobs. So hair, cleaning, construction, manufacturing, they all depend on subcontracted labour supplies, often internationally. Increasingly, you find individual workers having to sweat themselves much more to just put food on the table. So there's an increase in self-employment, where people often work for their own boss, but they take all the risk of the labour market on themselves. Zero-hour contracts are the most obvious example. And recent statistics show that about 10%, it's hard to believe, 10% of the UK labour market is now on self-employed contracts. Another 14% on self-employed. Then you've got all the ones in sub. So this is a huge phenomenon that's grown really from very, very low base 30 years ago. Austerity's just added to it. So the downward pressure on wages, there's been real wage cuts now for the last few years for most of these workers. So we did, the things I'm talking about really came out of a big project I did with colleagues at Queen Mary, which we published as Global Cities at Work. And what we did at that stage was go out and find out what were the low-wage jobs in London like and who was doing them. And right across the sectors we picked, we found that no worker was getting what we used to call, in old-fashioned days, in the 1970s and 80s, the social wage, which was all the extra things you got. Like if you worked overtime, you got time and a half. If you worked bank holidays, you got double time. If you did any overtime, you got extra pay. We found most of the workers doing these jobs get nothing but their rate of pay. They get minimum holidays, minimum entitlements, nothing that is not legislated for. So they might be getting minimum wage, but if they do overtime, they're still getting paid the minimum wage. There's no extra pension rights, there's no sick pay. So we found lots of cleaners, cleaning hospitals who don't get sick pay. They come to work because they're sick and they spread germs around the hospital. Because what's happened, of course, with subcontracting is the services have been dispatched to the market, and the real employer, the person who's really in charge, is no longer held accountable or responsible for the terms and conditions of work. And this is this model of capitalism all over the world. It has the same consequences. So it means in-work poverty is now growing, everybody knows this, but it's about 1 in 5 of the UK population who are working don't get the living wage. And then there's a lot in the band just above it, which the living wage is conservative as a calculation. So this is costing us, the taxpayer, huge amounts of money. Because it has political consequences. If wages fall so low, the incentives to work get undermined. More and more people are better off on the welfare system, which costs the state money. So what Gordon Brown in his wisdom did was bring in tax credits to top up people's income. to try and incentivise work, and that's just added to the welfare bill. So now, I don't know if you can read that, but since tax credits came in, the numbers of people claiming them and the amount of money involved is going up. So now it's probably 5 million households in the UK getting tax credits, and it costs us about £30 billion a year. So this is a huge subsidy that is basically going from the taxpayer to low-wage employers who are now under no pressure to increase wages beyond the national minimum wage. So what was a well-intentioned Labour policy to do something about poverty is actually now propping up this low-wage system. So I think we have a massive political mess, and so the question I really want to focus on is politics here. Because it's a political problem that work is no longer incentivised, it's a political problem that it costs us all a fortune, it's a political problem that's propping up really degraded jobs for 50% of the population to go and do, which has no satisfaction, it's not fulfilling, it's not productive. And then bigger than that, it probably has consequences for democracy itself. So I've mentioned the kind of political motivation. This little handout here, I don't know if you can read that at all, can you? It says support the Adam Brooks domestics, because in the 1980s, when subcontracting really kicked off, Mrs. Thatcher's government passed 2 key laws. One was about market testing in the NHS, so that NHS organisations had to market test their routinized service jobs like domestic labour in a hospital, and the local government had to do compulsory competitive tendering, CCT, which means it was forced to put its own services out to the market. So this was classic early Thatcherism, and one of the key disputes was actually at Adam Brooks Hospital in Cambridge, and it was one of my first ever picket lines in 1983, and I'd just come here to be a student. I got on my bike at 6 o'clock in the morning, went down there, and this was union protests going on, quite rightly, to resist the downward pressure of terms and conditions of the cleaners at Adam Brooks Hospital. And they were in the vanguard of this new neoliberalisation, which of course now we see the consequences of it 30 years later with mass immiseration, and this experience becoming the norm, because what happened in the 1980s is that unions fought these battles one by one and tended to lose them. So then there was an argument that you can't really do very much about this model of capitalism, because what this model does is it outsources groups. So say we were a cleaning contract, we're outsourced to a different company. If we then unionise ourselves, by law we can bargain with our employer, and our employer would be the outsourced company. It wouldn't be the real employer who's actually setting the terms and conditions of work. So there's a big political question here about power, and how is it that working people can get the power they need to change their terms and conditions of work, the bargain of labour at a national level as well. And that's where there's a big question about what kind of union organising or labour organising works in this model of capitalism. Because if you just keep sticking to the old model of workplace trade unionism, you're pricing yourself out of the market, and you're never going to win. So I want to spend most of my talk, and I know I've gone on too long already, on the living wage, because it's an example of a different kind of politics that's actually won something in this very difficult terrain. So it's about finding new sources of power. So the living wage campaign was launched in 2001. I just happened, because right near where I work, so I happened to be at that first meeting. It was April 2001. For the first time, Unison paid for the calculation to find out what was a living wage. Because in 2001, no one used this language. It wasn't part of the lex. We just won the national minimum wage for the first time ever in 1999, and that is set in relation to what the market will bear. So it's a market-determined rate. No one knew what you actually needed to live on, what was the cost of living, and what would that look like as a wage. So the first stage of this campaign was finding out roughly what a living wage would look like, and then deciding to go out and campaign for it. And you can imagine in 2001, most people thought this was nuts. This was a very small community alliance, a coalition of faith, labour, some chute unions then, but not many, university department like mine, some community groups, getting together and saying they were going to tackle this labour market. People never thought it would win. So what I thought would be useful to do is to talk you through how it has won, because it's amazed me during this time, and it's an interesting thing to think about. Why has this worked? So at the moment, the living wage for London is £8.80 an hour, £6.31 outside. Sorry, £6.31 is the national minimum wage, so it's usually about 40% above the national minimum wage. It's about, 40% gap. And the Living Wage Foundation, which I'll mention in a minute, has this logo, and it's been signing up employers that agree to pay it, just like fair trade, to try and shape the market through consumers and people spending their money to support ethical employers. So this logo is now used widely, and 800 organisations across the UK have signed up now. So it has got some momentum behind it. It's been very successful. So my big questions then are, how has it done this? Why? And what are the lessons for thinking about politics? Because this morning we were talking a lot about the left, and the left needs to do this. The left, lots of the people who've done this stuff would never think of themselves as left. And I don't think it's a helpful way to think about what political opportunities are for us in the present period. So I've got 5 kind of points about why I think it's worked, which I'll read the through. The first is because it's about institutions and networks. So the organisation that launched this thing is called London Citizens, or Citizens UK now, it's across the country. And what it does is take a geographical area, so the area around the college, say where I work, is Tower Hamlets, you could say, and then looks at civil society organisations within that geographical area. Where is the people power? These are people who haven't got any economic power, but where's their people power? Find these islands of social capital and make connections between them. So this is a map of the East London area. There's dots on the map, and these are organisations, schools and churches, mosques, community centres that have signed up to this organisation. And the argument is that if you build relationships between them, you then build much greater people power, so that you can start to force the state and the market to negotiate with you about what happens in your geographical patch. So it really goes back to 1930 Chicago, which we don't have time to talk about at all. This guy, Saul Alinsky, is the guy that kind of started this sort of politics. And of course, there's lots of takes on it since. And it's about geography, civil society, and networks. And that, in a way, fits with our times. Because people talk a lot about how place doesn't matter anymore, as though everything's about networks. Place does matter. We live in places, we work in places, we belong to institutions, but they are networked, and we need to operate at a scale big enough to give us enough power, and that's what this model is doing. The second thing it's innovating is related to literally starting from scratch, being ambitious, but going step by step over a decade. And in the first period of this campaign, it took 2 or 3 years to win the first victory. So it wasn't easy, it took a lot of time, and the focus was on the hospitals in East London, which I mentioned. So this is Homerton Hospital, and the big towers at Canary Wharf. So this is the AGM of HSBC. Canary Wharf had been in existence at this time for almost 20 years, and it was union-free. It employed thousands and thousands of people by this stage, and there were no unions organised there at all. So the early efforts were to target the big towers as they went up and say, if you're going to come to East London, you need to pay a living wage for your cleaners inside your towers. And at that time, the T&G were active, you can see them there, who are now Unite, and they had a cleaners campaign that worked with the Alliance to try and work inside the tower and outside the tower to do a pincer movement on the real employer who ran the show inside the tower to sign up to living wage. So it took 2 or 3 years to win those first victories. Barclays signed up, interestingly, before Canary Wharf, and the hospitals in East London signed up. And what's been interesting about the campaign is that you have to find a kind of market leader. So we live in neoliberal times. Markets are important to politics as well. You find a market leader who signs up, and then it shames the other people. And what most organisations care about more than anything are their competitors. So if Barclays signs up to be a living wage tower, that makes HSBC look really bad next door and not paying it. So once you've got one market leader, it's easier to win others. So Queen Mary, for instance, we were the first university to sign up to be the first living wage campus. Since then, other universities have followed suit, and our procurement team will go out and talk to other university procurement teams who are looking into it and thinking about it. So it's used the market to good political effect. The other thing it's done really successfully is frame the issue in a way that speaks to people. So unions are all too often saying it's my members. They come out on television, these old white guys saying it's my members want 1%. It doesn't travel, it doesn't speak to anybody, you can't feel any empathy or solidarity with the message. Even looking at the people, you can't. It's just not the way to do politics. So here what we have is a framing of a very classic union issue, wages and conditions, but it's framed around a language that everybody can understand. And it's interesting, when I watch Question Time now on television, people often in the audience stick their hand up and talk about the living wage, without realising that they're using this language that's been framed by a political campaign over a period of years that's now become part of the lexicon. And the union movement has not learned that kind of lesson about how it frames itself in terms of a mediatised world. The media is incredibly powerful. Fourth thing it's done is find allies. So it's worked by, obviously it's got its roots in this geographical network, but it's then worked from there to find different allies who can work with it. So one of the key funders for the campaign has been a funding group called Trust for London, which has its origins in the Church of England and a parochial fund set up to tackle poverty in London. And they then they funded it to almost £1 million, so money has come from charitable organisations. They set up an advisory group, and because again, arm's length, it's easier for these more official bodies to do this, with business in the community, London First, the Greater London Authority, London councils, all sitting around the table with representatives thinking how we're going to make the living wage work. So then you've got a whole lot of other allies doing your political work for you. And using the kind of market against the employers. So this logo then becomes a way of rewarding the people who do the right thing. So the Living Wage Foundation was set up in 2011 to move it out of London. For the first decade it was in London, and then there were more and more organisations and campaigners outside London looking to do it. So it became a national foundation, as I say, modelled on fair trade in a way that if you sign up, and there's a legal agreement you have to sign to put hand on heart, proper monitoring, you are paying the living wage to all your staff and all your contracted staff within certain provisions, but anyone who's in your premises doing your work for you has to be included. You can then use this logo to brand yourself. And again, what the campaigners did was set up a big broad church of organisations as founding partners in the foundation, so that you can then get all these kinds of big charities, Save the Children, big bodies like Linklaters, Aviva, some companies that have signed up, they want to milk it for their brand. So you're using the market against itself to make change. Allies, again, politically, and I mentioned the fact that we don't have economic power, but they do have political power, particularly around elections. And elections have proved a really important point to put pressure on political representatives to support living wage. It was done with Ken Livingstone in 2005. He was asked a big assembly, so this is Westminster Central Hall, where the membership of this broad alliance turn out. On the stage, will you support living wage, yes or no? One-word answers. And then he's held to that. And because he'd done it, and the GLA took over setting the rate in London, then Boris Johnson was asked the same question before he was elected in 2008. He said yes, and then he was held to it. And actually, Boris Johnson's delivered more living wage jobs than Ken Livingstone did, because there's more democratic power and accountability in this alliance now than there was when Ken Livingstone was in charge. That then model is being applied nationally, so there was a similar big public assembly before the 2010 election. Gordon Brown actually did a brilliant speech, and it was a bit like the referendum. It's like at the last minute, the day before the election, he pulled something out of a bag, and did really well supporting it. But all the party leaders were there, and they all put the same questions, do you support it or not? So democratic power has been really important, and through democratic power you can then look at public procurement chains. So that model of capitalism I was talking about is endemic in the public sector, and if you can get the political heads to sign up, you then try and insist that living wage is built into public procurement. So that was a big thing done around the Olympics 2012. Where the living wage was pushed through the contracting chain for the first time. So this has now become part of the national language discourse, the politics in the Labour Party manifesto. Bishops and so on have been supporting it, and it shows you what can be done. I won't go into this, but there's parallels in history, very much so, with parallels going back to the Webs. If you read the Webs, they talked about challenging the law of supply and demand with the law of the living wage. 100 years ago, they campaigned for wages councils that ended up being supported by Winston Churchill because there was a coalition of support from faith, from unions, from community. The Catholic Church important in both periods to do it. I just wanted to end by saying, so what? I mean, what does it tell us? it's very much against the academic language that we talk about in terms of politics. It's damn depressing. Every dominant framework for understanding the contemporary period is about post-democracy, post-politics, zombie neoliberalism. There's no hope in any of it. And it's because partly we're stuck in this left thing. We're looking for this left agent, this left politics, which we're not going to find because our politics is shifting all the time and we need to catch up with it. So in many senses, the living wage gives us a sense of hope for various reasons that I won't repeat. And I hope that's covered enough. Sorry.
Okay, finally we have Dr. Manali Desai, who's here with us in the Department of Sociology, and she's going to talk to us today about something she knows very much about, middle-class mobilization, the politics of crisis and corruption in India.
Right, well, I think my talk does speak to some of the issues in slightly different ways that have just been raised. I think this is actually, follows an interesting way, although my talk's located primarily in India, where some of you might think, well, it's a highly specific case, but on the other hand, I think a lot of the questions raise, more general, have a more general import. So the middle classes has, in a sense, rightly become the focus of attention in emerging markets and developing economies. In India, the huge growth of this strata is centered on push for market reforms, to be deepened and extended, and has elected governments that are more likely to do so. So in a sense, the argument is that the middle class is what's driving so much of the change in India. However, there are two main problems with this argument. First of all, in India, the reliable estimates place the size of the stable middle class, if you're really interested in theories of middle class and democratic development, the size of the stable middle class is only about 7% of the population. That's actually quite generous. It ranges from somewhere between 5 to 7% of the population. And in fact, most studies show that it's what they call in-betweeners. It's really those who are neither officially poor nor stable middle class, who are, roughly anywhere between, and the studies really vary, somewhere between 35 to 63, 65% of the population. And these are households that are earning somewhere between roughly $2 to $8 a day purchasing power parity wages. Okay, now why am I drawing attention to this? I mean, it's interesting because in a sense, when you look closely at these studies, which I've been doing for much too long, it's really, you get a sense that just the measurement of the middle class itself in these various studies is really highly contested and very fraught. But nevertheless, the comparative data, the comparative studies do suggest, if they're based on income alone, that there is somewhere between an income level of somewhere between $2 to $10 a day is where you would locate the middle class. Now this is an astonishing claim, because in a sense, somewhere between 2 to 10 is a very wide range. And those studies that have narrowed in a little bit on this have said that actually what is really important, and this is an ILO study from 2013, says that although globally there's been a drop in the number of what they call the working poor, it's the number of what they call the near poor. Now, again, these definitions are fascinating, or what's working poor, near poor, not so poor. The number of near poor, and this is important, between $2 to $4 purchasing power parity wages. This is the percentage of the population, globally speaking, that is likely to grow, and this is future estimates, to about 40 to 50% of the total of the global population. Now, a lot of these studies are really looking at quote-unquote developing countries. So it's really South and Southeast Asia, Africa, primarily Latin America. And what they're arguing is that the development of the market reforms are pushing a lot of people out of poverty. But what these studies are showing over and over again is they're getting stuck in what we're calling the near poor. Now this is interesting, that another study specifically located, was a global study, but also the data in India shows that whereas lots and lots of millions of households have come out of poverty since the reforms in 1991 began, and globally speaking, since market reforms began, there's a bunching up of the population at just above the median. So this is where the majority of them end up stuck. So this kind of linear resumption for growth in the middle classes is really problematic. And you know, by the way, in India, the poverty line is actually so, you know, sort of stingy and has been actually just readjusted after a lot of debate at something like 77 cents a day for urban areas. So if you're really looking at near poor being $2, then 77 cents a day is you know, a poverty line itself is quite astonishing. And in a sense, this has been something that has been highly debated. Now, why is this important? The mainstream view that is held, for example, by organizations like ILO or World Bank or state governments, is that the secular growth of middle-class populations and the emergence of people out of poverty will create a greater trend towards productivity, towards higher growth, more investment in education, and democratic stability. So it's the middle classes that are seen as being primarily interested in political accountability and a decline in corruption. And all of these things are held to be much better for economic growth rates. But there is another skeptical view, and if you read someone like Paul Mason, you know, and why is it all kicking off, and so on and so forth, a lot of these people are arguing that even while there has been a rise in disposable incomes and savings, these so-called developing middle classes, which again is an interesting term, have to contend with rising inequality. And they live, if they don't, even if they have emerging poverty, they live cheek by jowl with poverty, with poor infrastructure, and corruption, and so forth. And what he argues, and some others have argued as well, is that it is really this section of the population, globally speaking, that has been involved in protest movements in Egypt or Brazil, in Turkey, and in India. India's anti-corruption movement is seen as sort of being primarily led by this class of people. Now, in his New Left Review article, Göran Thurborn argued, it's called Class in the 21st Century, he asked, is the 21st century a century of the middle class, where the middle class becomes a symbol of the future in which the modernity of the working class, quote, and of socialism have become obsolete. And he asked, will it be a century of consumption, or will it be a century of democracy? You know, reading the question, it's an interesting way to pose this question. Now, certainly at some level you could say that, you know, there are many who are arguing that really the model of the middle class consumer society has been celebrated by, obviously, those who become part of it, you know, through a dream world of endless consumption and shopping malls that are ubiquitous across the developing world, so-called, but also by a range of experts and state officials, not least, if anyone has ever come across the Bird of Gold report by McKinsey, which really looks at India as a bird of gold that will, with the rise of people out of poverty and into the middle classes, will yield a kind of, you know, a bonus, a massive bonus for multinationals and various others. However, even this ILO report that I'm referring to suggests that actually by 2017, the biggest share of the employed in South Asia and Africa will actually be the poor or the near poor, the section that I was talking about. And this prediction is paralleled by a decade or over of jobless growth in India. So between 2004 to 2005 to 2010, when the economic reforms had really deepened and intensified, employment grew by only 1 million, okay, representing an employment elasticity of zero, practically zero. And what does that mean? Basically that the employment does not rise in keeping with the high, so every percentage of economic growth doesn't yield much rise in employment levels. From 2010 till, you know, between 2009 to 2012, roughly speaking, 13 million new jobs have been added. So this is actually interesting after the financial crisis across, you know, most of the world. 13 million new jobs were added in India, but these were in the informal sector. So these are primarily, these are the casualized, insecure jobs, you know, lacking insurance and benefits regulation. And so basically, you know, I think this characteristic is also a very important backdrop to what I want to say about politics. Unemployment among youth is also significantly higher in India, and that actually what is also interesting I wanted to mention is that the employment elasticity, which is almost zero in the post-reform period, was much higher in the pre-reform market reform period. So essentially market reforms in India have not been generating jobs, employment. Okay, so although much academic and media attention has focused on the middle classes, with all the assumptions of linearity that go along with it, and I think many you know, scholars kind of unwittingly sort of imbibe that idea. In essence, in an everyday sense, politics in India has actually been played out in crisis mode. And the last election, I will argue, one of the most recent one, we're still in 2014, so this year, was in a sense played out in that mode. Now, the major political parties in India fought this election on the basis of the idea that India was in the grips of an economic crisis that had been created by too little market integration. In other words, there were bottlenecks led by the Congress Party, which had been in power for a decade, and that had weakened the Indian economy. It was a corrupt state that had overspent on subsidies and programs, that had expanded entitlement in areas of health education. We know these sorts of arguments, it's fairly familiar. And the agenda that the BJP wanted to propose was really essentially a leaner state and what they called good governance. But it's not, what is really interesting about this election campaign is that for the BJP, it was not the old campaign of India shining. I mean, the last campaign that they had fought for was really on the basis of a middle-class consumer boom, that really India was now arriving into a new era of democratic and market stability. Instead of that, actually the BJP shifted its rhetoric completely away from that and started to focus much more on the ordinary man. And the ordinary man, in fact, played a vital role for all the parties. This is the focus of the campaign. Now we see this in the Congress Party had campaigned, and I had introduced this lexicon into the debate on Indian politics through this idea of the Aam Aadmi, which is the ordinary person, you and me, just really bringing it down to that level. And the BJP also appropriated that rhetoric while coining other terms such as neo-middle class, to really refer to the group of people that I've been talking about. These are people who come out of poverty but aspiring to become middle class. So the term aspirational is used quite a lot here as well. But the middle class idea or utopia has faded from view in this discourse, and instead the argument was that transparency and good governance for the ordinary man, you and me, is what was needed to replace it. So when Modi came to power finally won the elections and came to power, the argument was that he had tapped into the frustrations of generations of Indians who had climbed out of poverty but been prevented from joining the middle classes because of slowing growth and a lack of employment. Now the focus on the ordinary man is a classic populist construction. This person or woman or man actually has no class or other characteristics. All they are is that they're honest, seeking truth, they want the basics, they want food, clothing, and roof over their houses, and what's been done is that they've been cheated out of these things by powerful people. And this is a very, very powerful strain that goes back to the independence period, this sort of anti-corruption, common man argument. It's very interesting that that is actually being revived now by all these parties in the context of nearly 2 decades of market reforms. And I want to talk a little bit now about a third entrant into the elections. And this was not, obviously the Congress and the BJP were the two primary players. There's a third upstart, as they were called, the Aam Aadmi Party. So here is a political party that was formed by pointing itself basically on the basis of this ordinary man idea. And the Aam Aadmi Party was formed essentially by two former bureaucrats. They were, actually part of the government, high-level bureaucrats with access to all sorts of interesting information. And the AAP actually drew on a whole bunch of different strands within Indian politics, including socialist strand of Indian politics. So the AAP was, in a sense, a very big and networked group of people who had various ideological tendencies. And the argument, their primary goal was really, the primary trope, in a sense, was anti-corruption. They brought out all kinds of amazing and very, very high-level evidence against politicians and their families about tracking very carefully in a forensic manner the degree to which the ruling class, in a sense, has been enmeshed in a variety of big, deals in the arm, in the sale of arms, whether it's sale of arms, whether it's all sorts of major investments, international investments, and so forth. Okay, so this is a very savvy, media-savvy, sophisticated sort of operation using what the big thing was sting operations. They would actually, bring about these big sort of media savvy sting operations that will aim at scaring a lot of the ruling classes. Now, what I want to say about the ARP actually is that to understand the entry of this party that won the elections to the Delhi State Assembly in 2013. So this is a party that actually at one time, not very long ago, seemed about to break apart the monopoly of the two major parties in India. And they had a huge amount of support from young people and a huge amount of support in the middle classes. So really this looked like a moment at which middle-class activism could just about be taken a different turn and could bring about some very interesting change in Indian politics. However, the ARP itself, their social support was really divided between the more professional middle classes, such as the doctors, lawyers, teachers, students, etc., as well as, on the other hand, what I've called this near poor. You know, these are people who are not, their base isn't so much among the poorest in, particularly in urban India, but it is among, migrant workers, domestic help, construction workers, contract workers of various kinds, for whom the concept of corruption was less about the abstraction of ruling class and ruling parties, and more about everyday corruption, which really prevented them from getting on with their livelihoods. So paying somebody to actually get access to workplaces, to get transportation, the constant need to grease palms to actually make a living is what really was problematic for them. And I think that ARP really managed to tap into both concepts of, both ideas of anti-corruption, both the middle classes for whom the ruling parties were problematic in a larger sense, as well as for this section of the population. But however, one of the problems with and there's several problems, I mean, I can talk about it in the discussion, I just wanted to draw attention to a couple of things. First of all, by winning elections in the State Assembly, it may be the case that ARP as an insurgent party grabbed power much too early, that they were forced to make decisions to start taking leadership decisions, start taking decisions as part of the state, when their experience is very limited with this sort of thing. And this, I think, ended up in massively discrediting them. This is something that the major parties were really looking for. It was a great moment in which to discredit and delegitimize them. This is something that really, I think, affected them. The second is that ARP was not really a movement. I mean, at some level, it really was a network of very interesting insurgent activities, but it didn't extend to rural areas. It was very limited to cities in parts of India, not really particularly a national party in that sense. And what I think is really interesting at the end is that when the BJP won power in the most recent elections, it really rode on this wave of discontent, both simultaneously in terms of mopping up the anti-corruption energy, political energy, but the failures of ARP in actually taking this in any particular direction. And so many of the younger, lower middle classes and the quote-unquote near poor that I'm talking about really shifted their vote to the BJP. And that is why they won this historic vote in the last elections. So I think, in conclusion, really, India may be an important instance of a wider global economic and employment crisis, and following its politics can be useful for understanding the problems and perils of mobilization under these conditions, when a certain kind of volatility within these, this broader stratum and undefined in class terms can be made to the swing to the right or to the left. And these also offer opportunities for the left. They can also be very problematic. And I think for the future, if the BJP really fails to deliver this kind of growth with jobs, there is likely to be an increase in volatility, and the language of crisis is likely to be renewed further. This could be encouraging or worrying depending on what takes its place, but it is unlikely to be politics as usual.
Okay, we have about a half hour for conversation here. Many provocative things were said, so let's open it up for a round of questions, comments.